Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slide deep into the velvet-draped shadows of ancient Rome, where marble palaces shimmer under torchlight, senators whisper in marble halls, and one emperor, infamous even in his own time, plays the lyre while the world burns around him. His name is Nero, and he's about to make you question everything you thought you knew about madness, love and power. But fair warning, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because tonight's tale may just keep you up a little later than planned. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nero doesn't burst onto the stage of Roman history like a conqueror. He tiptoes in with all the drama of a spoiled teenager handed the keys to a kingdom. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, he's technically just a noble brat with decent lineage until his mother, Agrippina the Younger, ambitious, clever, possibly murderous, marries the Emperor Claudius and finagles Nero's adoption. Voila. Suddenly Nero is next in line for the most powerful job in the world. No pressure. When Claudius mysteriously dies, after a conveniently suspicious plate of mushrooms, Nero ascends to the throne at just 16 years old. Picture it. A gangly teen with bad poetry and worse impulse control, now ruling an empire of 60 million souls. For a little while, he plays the part of the good emperor. He listens to his tutors, Seneca and Burrus. He pretends to care about the Senate, he even reduces taxes. The Roman public sighs in relief. Maybe this kid's not so bad after all. But, oh, that doesn't last. Within a few short years, Nero tires of playing the golden boy. He discovers that ruling is dull, endless paperwork and flatterers, and that being feared is more fun than being respected. And besides, he has passions. He loves acting, music, chariot racing, and above all, himself. He performs in public, scandalizing the elites. He hosts games, concerts, and lavish orgies with all the subtlety of a glitter cannon. Rome is no longer run from the Senate, but from Nero's imagination, and sometimes his nightmares. One of Nero's favourite games is collecting people. Not just friends and lovers, but symbols, human trophies that reflect back his twisted fantasies. He surrounds himself with flatterers, fawning poets, sycophantic lovers. Among them are men and women, both beautiful and terrified, who learn quickly that Nero's attention is a gilded curse. To win his favour is to be lifted into heaven. To lose it, well, just ask his mother, Agrippina, whom he has murdered on a boat after several failed poison attempts. And then there's the fire. In 64 AD, a great blaze consumes much of Rome. It burns for 6 days, levels entire districts and leaves tens of thousands homeless. Now Nero wasn't even in the city when it started. He's at his villa in Antium. But when he returns, rumours flare up faster than the flames. People whisper that Nero himself started it, perhaps to clear space for a grand new palace. The great Domus Aurea, or Golden House, rises soon after, complete with rotating dining rooms and artificial lakes. Subtle. To deflect suspicion, Nero blames the Christians, a small, strange sect at the time, and unleashes horrific persecutions. But the damage is done. The people, the Senate, even Rome's allies begin to eye Nero with unease. This emperor, they whisper, is unhinged. Still, amid all this chaos, Nero finds time for love, or at least his version of it. He's already gone through one wife, Octavia, whom he accuses of infertility and has executed. Then comes Poppaea Sabina, his second empress, a woman of legendary beauty and razor-sharp ambition. But that's a tale for the next chapter. Tonight, let's linger just a little longer in Nero's Rome. Imagine the city at dusk, wine shops closing, sandal-clad feet clapping on cobblestones, the smell of roasted olives mixing with smoke from the baths. But there's always something off in the air, a tension, as if the whole capital is holding its breath, wondering what strange, decadent idea the emperor will have next. And here's the thing, Nero believes he's an artist. Not just any artist, a divine one. He sees himself as a poet, a singer, a tragedian touched by the gods. He performs publicly in Greece, collects prizes, demands applause. No one dares boo. A few unfortunate souls fall asleep during a recital and are never seen again. There's a running joke that you bring lunch and a pillow to a Nero performance, just in case it runs 6 hours. It usually does. Historians still argue whether Nero was truly insane or simply consumed by his own theatre. Some say he's a monster, others a misunderstood genius. Either way, the result is the same. A ruler who sees Rome not as a republic or an empire, but as a stage. And every tragedy needs its centrepiece. Which brings us to the whispers that begin in the wake of Poppeia's death. Whispers that Nero, grief-stricken and obsessed, begins looking for a replacement. Not just any companion, mind you. Someone who looks like her, acts like her, is her. Enter Sporus. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, the city goes to sleep, or tries to. Outside Nero's palace, flickering torches cast shadows of marble gods across the walls. The guards, clad in bronze and exhaustion, trade glances and wonder what fresh madness tomorrow will bring. Inside, somewhere in the vastness of the Domus Aurea, Nero reclines on a couch of ivory and silk, murmuring lines of tragic verse to no one in particular. He thinks of love, of legacy, and of the one woman who may have truly held his heart. But even in death, Poppeia's story is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. Oh, and if you think you know where this tale is going, think again. Poppaea Sabina doesn't enter the stage quietly. Even in a city where wealth drips from every temple and ambition hums in every senator's household, she stands out, first for her beauty, then for the remarkable way she plays the Roman social ladder like a harp. Before she ever catches Nero's eye, she's already woven herself into the power web of elite Rome, with the precision of a spider arranging its next meal. Born around 30 AD to a noble family, Poppaea grows up surrounded by status and expectation. Her father is a praetor, her mother celebrated for her virtue. But Poppaea herself, she's less interested in virtues and more in victories. Marriages are her battlefield. By the time she meets Nero, she's already cycled through 2 husbands, Rufrius Crispinus, with whom she has a son, and then Otho, one of Nero's close friends. It's with Otho that the drama really begins. Poppaea knows how to shimmer in a crowd, how to tilt her head just so, how to speak in soft, clever riddles that leave powerful men guessing. Otho brings her to court, perhaps thinking she'll secure his own position. Instead, she catches the emperor's attention, and once Nero locks onto something or someone, he does not let go. The affair is fast, passionate, and entirely predictable. Nero wants Poppaea, and what Nero wants, Nero takes. He pushes Otho aside, shipping him off to govern a province far, far away. It's Rome's version of an HR transfer. Otho accepts it because saying no to Nero has a short shelf life. The road from alley to corpse is remarkably short under this emperor. With Otho gone, Poppaea moves in. But there's a problem. Nero's still technically married. His first wife, Octavia, is popular and politically useful, but she's reserved, modest, and utterly uninterested in flattery. In other words, the polar opposite of Poppaea. And Nero is bored, so he does what any unhinged, paranoid emperor might do. He accuses Octavia of infertility and adultery, has her banished, and later, after public outcry forces a second accusation, has her executed. It's said her head is sent to Poppaea as a sort of grotesque wedding gift. Poppaea is now empress. Nero, ever the romantic, names her Augusta. Together they reign as Rome's most decadent couple. Think ancient Kardashians, but with more murder. Poppaea, intelligent and ruthlessly poised, knows how to keep Nero enthralled. She flatters his ego, supports his performances, and carefully dodges his tantrums. She's rumoured to have a team of servants whose sole job is to bathe her in milk to preserve her skin, though historians still argue whether this is fact or a smear campaign by later moralists. One contemporary writer, Suetonius, paints Poppaea as manipulative and vain, while others describe her as shrewd and politically aware. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere in between. But one thing is clear. She understands Nero. She reads his moods like omens and knows how to bend them to her advantage. When Nero wants flattery, she offers it. When he wants passion, she stokes it. When he wants cruelty, she looks the other way. By 65 AD, Poppaea has given birth to a daughter, Claudia Augusta, securing her place as mother of a future heir. The child dies young, unfortunately, likely from illness. But for a brief moment, Nero has what every emperor wants, a dynastic future. He lavishes Poppaea with gifts, jewels, titles, even a fleet of eunuch servants just for her, and throws feasts in her honour where guests are expected to recite poems about her radiance. It's the kind of over-the-top adoration that would embarrass a modern influencer. But for Nero, it's not enough, because even in the golden rooms of the Domus Aurea, there's always tension. Nero's paranoia deepens. Senators are executed on flimsy rumours, advisors disappear, Rome simmers under a blanket of fear, and Poppaea, despite all her finesse, cannot completely control the storm. Then, in 65 AD, tragedy, or perhaps something darker, strikes. Accounts differ wildly on what happens next. Some say Poppaea, heavily pregnant, gets into an argument with Nero. In a fit of rage, he kicks her in the abdomen, killing both her and the unborn child. Others suggest it was an accident, or that she died of natural causes. Tacitus, never one to downplay a good scandal, leans into the violence. Suetonius echoes the rumour, but then again, both historians are writing decades later with a clear dislike for Nero. Historians still argue whether Poppaea's death was a crime of passion, a tragic accident, or pure propaganda. What's chilling is that the one man who could clarify it, Nero, offers no public explanation. Instead, he launches into grief with the theatrical flair of a tragedian. He mourns publicly, wailing at her funeral, forbidding anyone to speak her name in vain. He has her embalmed not in traditional Roman fashion, but in incense and exotic spices, an Eastern rite that scandalizes the conservatives. Her body is laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus, a burial fit for gods. Nero weeps and weeps, and then begins to spiral. He commissions statues of her, orders poets to immortalize her beauty. He insists that no one else could ever compare. The man who murdered his own mother, who watched Rome burn and fiddled through the night, is now inconsolable over the loss of his golden empress. And then it gets truly strange. Within months, Nero begins seeking out boys, young, delicate-featured, and eerily similar to Poppaea. His advisors murmur. The court trembles. It's not unusual for Roman elites to keep lovers of both sexes, but Nero's fixation seems specific, obsessive. And then he finds Sporus. Described by ancient sources as a young boy of remarkable beauty, Sporus is handpicked by Nero, not just as a companion, but as a replacement. He is castrated, dressed in royal garments, and paraded as Poppaea reincarnated. Some say Nero calls him by her name. Others claim he hosts a full-blown wedding ceremony, with Sporus in the role of bride and Nero as groom. Again, sources differ. Was Sporus a slave, a courtier's child, a captured noble? The records are vague, and it's likely no one asked the boy for his side of the story. All we know is this. From that moment on, Sporus ceases to be himself. He becomes Nero's living, breathing monument to lost love, a walking echo of a woman who may or may not have wanted to be empress in the first place. But that chapter belongs to Sporus, and his story deserves its own spotlight. For now, imagine Nero wandering the halls of his vast palace, trailed by a boy in silk who wears a dead woman's jewellery and answers to her name. The torches flicker, the fountains murmur, and Rome, ever watchful, begins to understand that its emperor has slipped fully into fantasy. Not that anyone dares say so out loud. The death of Poppaea Sabina sends a ripple through the imperial court, not just of grief, but of unease. Even in an empire used to poisonings, power grabs and public executions, something about her end feels different. It's sudden, messy, whispered about in corners but never openly discussed. And no one is really sure what happened. 3 versions of the story circulate through Rome like the wind in its twisting alleys. The first and most salacious, favoured by the ever-dramatic Tacitus, claims Nero kicked Poppaea in a fit of rage. She was pregnant again, and perhaps she complained about his late-night escapades, his drunken poetry readings, his growing paranoia. Maybe she dared to ask a question he didn't like. Or maybe he was just in a mood. Either way, a single blow to her belly and both mother and child were dead. It's a shocking tale, the kind that sticks, and later historians run with it. But there's no trial, no formal statement, not even a public hint of regret. That silence is louder than a confession. Suetonius, another fan of the lurid, repeats the same tale, though with less conviction. Then there's Dio Cassius, who cautiously suggests Poppaea may have died due to a miscarriage or complications from pregnancy? More medical, less murder? Historians still argue whether Nero was directly responsible or merely negligent. Could it have been illness? A uterine rupture? Ancient medicine is about as effective as using herbs and good vibes to heal a stab wound. Pregnancies were risky at best, deadly at worst. Yet the image of Nero, violent and impulsive, lashing out at the one woman he claimed to adore, it's too compelling for the Roman public to ignore. Rome, remember, is a city that thrives on gossip and spectacle. The imperial court is its theatre, and emperors are expected to keep the performance polished no matter the chaos backstage. But Nero's grief breaks the script. Instead of solemn mourning, he plunges into theatrical despair. He doesn't just mourn Poppaea, he enshrines her. He declares her a goddess, not metaphorically, officially. Statues go up, incense burns in her honour. The Senate, reluctant but spineless, nods along. Coins are minted with her image. It's grief with a PR budget. And then there's the embalming. Poppaea's body is not burned, as was Roman tradition, but preserved in rare Eastern spices and perfumes, more in line with Egyptian or Persian funerary rites. Her body is said to smell like heaven, and cost more than most senators earn in a decade. It's a burial fit for a queen of the myth, not the wife of a man who might have just murdered her. But even amid the perfume-scented spectacle, something is missing. Nero is restless, listless. He hosts feasts and plays his lyre, but there's a hollowness now. The court, always attuned to the emperor's whims, senses it. He doesn't want just to remember Poppaea. He wants to bring her back. And this is where the story shifts from strange to surreal. At first, Nero seeks comfort in the usual way. More parties, more flattery, more distractions. He surrounds himself with actors, athletes, dancers, courtesans. But none of them are her. None of them silence the ringing in his ears, the ever-growing sense that his masterpiece, his life's tragic opera, is missing its star. Then, one day, someone is brought before him. A boy. The sources are vague on where he comes from. Some say he was a slave. Others suggest he was the son of a nobleman punished by Nero. What all accounts agree on is this. The boy's name is Sporus, and he looks almost exactly like Poppaea Sabina. That's all it takes. Nero orders the boy castrated. The act itself is never described in detail, and perhaps that's for the best. But make no mistake, this isn't an adoption or a mentorship, it's a transformation. Sporus is not being brought into the palace as himself, but as someone else entirely. New clothes are made, robes, veils, silken slippers. Jewellery once worn by Poppaea is placed on the boy's hands. Perfume is dabbed at his throat. His voice, already high from youth, is now locked in place. His name, still Sporus, but among the court. Another whispers behind it. Poppaea. And then Nero stages a wedding. Yes, a wedding. It's not a quiet, private affair. It's a ceremony held in public with full imperial pomp. Nero dons the robes of a groom. Sporus is dressed as a bride. Witnesses are summoned, vows are exchanged, there is music, applause. The whole of Rome watches, unsure whether to laugh, cry or flee. There's no precedent for this. Even in a city that tolerates emperors marrying statues and naming horses to the Senate, Nero's mock marriage to a boy is jaw-dropping. The Senate is silent. The people murmur. But no one challenges him. After all, Poppaea was beloved by many. Perhaps they reason that if Nero needs to see her face again to function, then so be it. Still, historians puzzle over this moment. Was it grief? Madness? A calculated piece of performance art? Some suggest Nero believed he could truly resurrect his wife through Sporus. Others think he was flaunting his power, the ultimate act of domination, to erase someone's identity and remake them in another's image. Or maybe it was something darker still, a delusion so profound that even Nero couldn't tell fiction from fact. One fringe theory, barely whispered in historical circles, is that Sporus was chosen not just for his looks, but because he had already known Poppaea, perhaps a page in her household, or the child of one of her attendants. If true, the psychological cruelty is staggering, but it remains just that, a theory. Regardless, the transformation is complete. Sporus, once an anonymous boy, is now the imperial bride. He appears at Nero's side during festivals, banquets, even official functions. Nero parades him through the streets, arm in arm, smiling for the crowd. The Empire watches, blinking, unsure whether it's witnessing tragedy or farce. It's important to note here that Rome had no clear boundaries when it came to sexuality. Same-sex relationships, particularly between older men and adolescent boys, were not uncommon, though there were rules about roles, status, and appearance. But Nero's marriage to Sporus shatters even those norms. He doesn't just love a boy. He demands the boy become a woman, not metaphorically, literally. And what of Sporus? He says nothing. He leaves no letters, no testimony. His face, carved on no coin, painted on no fresco, exists only in other people's words. His identity, his thoughts, his desires, all overwritten by Nero's mourning. Was he terrified? Was he flattered? Did he find some way to survive within the costume forced upon him? We don't know. We may never know. But he's there, in the shadows of Nero's palaces, trailing behind a madman who believes he's staging the greatest romance the Empire has ever seen. And in a way, perhaps he is. Because for Nero, this isn't just grief. It's not even love. It's theatre. And Sporus isn't a person. He's a role. A character in the Emperor's endless, ego-soaked tragedy. And the curtain is far from falling. Sporus stands at the edge of a surreal stage, Rome itself. One moment he's a boy known to few outside the palace walls, and the next he is something between myth and mirror. To Nero, Sporus is not a person, but a vessel. A blank page where the face of Poppaea Sabina can be redrawn, rewritten, resurrected. And so begins one of the most unsettling transformations in imperial history. Imagine the boy as he is led down polished marble corridors lined with gold-leafed nymphs and half-clad gods. His steps echo against walls that have heard conspiracies and confessions, his body freshly perfumed, his clothing delicate and embroidered. Draped not for comfort, but for spectacle. In public he walks one step behind the emperor, as an empress would. In private, no one quite knows what happens, but the outcome is clear. Sporus has become Nero's shadow bride. The palace staff adapts quickly, as palace staffs do. They bow when he enters, they avoid his eyes, they call him Lady Poppaea when Nero is near. He is expected to speak softly, smile faintly, and embody the ideal Roman matron, which for the record he never asked to be. The old Roman virtues, modesty, obedience, beauty, all applied now to a boy who once may have played in back halls and fetched scrolls, never dreaming he would one day sleep in the imperial bed. This isn't an isolated affair. Nero doesn't hide his obsession. He parades Sporus through public spaces like a prize horse, leading him to temples, feasts and performances. At a major festival, the Saturnalia, Nero reportedly appears in a bridal veil, holding Sporus's hand. The message isn't subtle. The emperor will grieve in his own way, and the rest of the world will applaud or else. To many Romans, this isn't just disturbing, it's deeply confusing. The lines between male and female, citizen and slave, living and dead, all blur within Nero's court. There's a running joke among the plebeians that Rome itself has died and returned as something else, just like Poppaea through Sporus. But few laugh too loudly. The punishments for mocking the emperor are swift, final, and increasingly creative. Still, the spectacle isn't without its admirers. Some sycophants praise Nero's devotion, calling it the ultimate act of love. He loved her so much, they say, that even death could not stop him. Others whisper that Sporus has been bewitched, that Nero drinks potions to see Poppaea's spirit in his dreams, or that he believes Sporus is literally possessed by her soul. These rumours aren't taken seriously, but they aren't dismissed either. Not in a Rome where gods walk in dreams and omens lurk in bird entrails. Meanwhile, Sporus plays his part. It's hard to know how much choice he ever had. He's still young, perhaps 13 or 14, and now carries the burden of a dead empress's legacy. He sits beside Nero during council sessions, offers flowers at rituals, and even receives foreign dignitaries. At one point he is seen dispensing alms to the poor from a balcony, just as Poppaea once did. There's no record of his thoughts, but we can guess. Confusion, fear, numbness, perhaps even resignation. Historians still debate whether Sporus had any agency at all. Some argue he was a survivor, cleverly adapting to the role to stay alive. Others see him as a victim so thoroughly controlled that the concept of choice becomes irrelevant. A few fringe theories suggest he may have leaned into the power, even influenced Nero's decisions from behind a silken veil. But with no voice of his own in the record, Sporus remains a figure defined entirely by others' stories. It's worth pausing here to remember, Sporus isn't alone in being remade under Nero's reign. The Emperor has a habit of transforming people into characters in his elaborate opera. He forces senators to act in plays, demands nobles perform in chariot races, and once dresses a favoured gladiator as a god just to watch him dine among mortals. Everyone in Nero's orbit becomes a prop, a set piece in the theatre of his madness. But Sporus is the centrepiece. Even the palace architecture seems to reflect this obsession. In Nero's sprawling Domus Aurea, mosaics depict scenes of mythological transformation, Daphne becoming a tree, Narcissus gazing at his reflection, Pygmalion sculpting his perfect woman. They aren't just decoration, they're foreshadowing. One chamber, nicknamed the rotating room, is said to slowly spin like the heavens while guests dine. Above them, painted constellations turn and perfumed petals fall from hidden shoots. It's the ultimate illusion. A world controlled, manipulated, and staged. And at the centre of that illusion now sits Sporus, neither fully man nor woman, neither free nor slave. Rome itself begins to feel the strain. The empire's borders are still expanding, the legions still marching, but inside the capital the foundation is cracking. The aristocracy is fed up. The Senate, humiliated by Nero's antics and terrified of his wrath, starts plotting. Conspiracies simmer. At one point, an entire ring of nobles is discovered planning the emperor's assassination. Nero, unsurprisingly, responds with a bloodbath. Heads roll, spouses betray each other, poets and generals alike fall to the sword, and all the while Sporus remains at Nero's side untouched. It's almost as if Nero believes that as long as Sporus lives, as long as Poppaea lives, he cannot truly be defeated. It's magical thinking, but Nero was never one for realism. One little-known detail. In private, Nero reportedly holds bizarre ceremonies, in which Sporus reenacts scenes from Poppaea's life. Dressed in her gowns, he walks through recreated rooms. Nero watches, sometimes weeping, sometimes applauding. One rumour even claims that Sporus performs Poppaea's final moments, collapsing in slow motion, tears painted onto his cheeks with saffron paste. If true, it's performance art at its darkest. But beneath the layers of incense and silk, the empire groans. Famine begins to spread in the provinces, taxation soars, local rebellions break out. The legions in distant outposts start to murmur about loyalty, not to the emperor but to their own generals. Nero, predictably, ignores the warning signs. He's too busy composing a new tragic play, one where a god loses his lover and builds a monument of stars in her memory. Guess who plays the lover? And so Sporus remains, draped in starlight and sorrow, the silent muse of an emperor teetering on the edge. He's a child forced into a role no one should bear. He is praised in public, pitied in whispers, and paraded like a prize mare before crowds who cheer because they must. He is a symbol, a victim, a mystery, and soon he will be something even stranger. The wedding of Nero and Sporus, if one dares to call it that, is not an isolated gesture of a man in grief. It becomes a living metaphor for Nero's reign, garish, surreal, and deeply disquieting. It's more than a bizarre love story. It's a political performance, a psychological declaration, and a cultural rupture all in one. The ceremony itself, if Roman writers are to be believed, is held with full imperial spectacle. A dowry is arranged, paid from the public treasury of course, and Sporus is dressed in the same regal attire Poppaea once wore as empress. Witnesses attend, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of morbid curiosity. A veiled Sporus is escorted down an aisle lined with musicians and flanked by perfumed guards. Nero wears a groom's toga, trimmed in purple, and places a ring on the boy's finger. The ritual vows, ancient, sacred, meant for the continuation of noble families, are twisted into an echo chamber for Nero's delusion, and no one dares laugh, not openly anyway. The upper echelons of Rome, the senators, the generals, the aristocrats, clench their jaws and bow low. The crowd applauds because that is safer than silence. The priests perform the rites because they've seen what happens to those who refuse Nero's commands. But even amid the forced smiles and mechanical clapping, a nervous energy pulses through the ceremony. Something has changed in the air of Rome. The line between theatre and reality has vanished, and they're all trapped in the script. Nero doesn't seem to notice, or care. He declares Sporus empress. No official decree is issued, but within the court, everyone treats the boy as such. He receives gifts. He's addressed with titles of respect. He's even given a retinue of attendants, all handpicked by Nero for their beauty and docility. Sporus now resides in the imperial quarters once belonging to Poppaea, among the silk drapes and polished bronze mirrors, a prisoner in a palace of ghosts. But the true madness is in the normalcy that follows. After the wedding, life in the palace continues as if nothing is unusual. Nero hosts dinners, writes tragedies, and takes to the stage in flowing robes to act out scenes from myth. The court obliges him, performing their parts with practised grace. Sporus is often present, seated beside the emperor, nodding demurely at the right moments, lifting his goblet in practised synchronicity. In portraits, though none survive directly from the time, he is imagined with coal-lined eyes, golden hair curled into precise waves, and lips set in an expression of eternal melancholy. Behind the scenes, of course, the whispers grow louder. The Senate is quietly horrified. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial security force, begins to discuss the emperor in coded language. Foreign dignitaries send home confused reports of the new bride. Even the general populace, long inured to Nero's antics, begins to murmur. Marrying a boy in a dress is not just unusual, it's a sign, a signal. Rome has lost its mind, or at least its emperor has. But Nero is utterly unfazed. He believes he has created something beautiful, a living monument to Poppaea, a story of love triumphing over death. In his eyes, Sporus is a masterpiece, a blend of memory and flesh, grief and devotion. He parades him through the streets in a litter studded with gems, often forcing citizens to kneel as it passes. One day, he reportedly halts the entire forum so Sporus can release a dove in honour of Venus, goddess of love. The gesture, intended to be poetic, instead becomes another absurd entry in the growing catalogue of imperial farce. Still, the machinery of Rome grinds on. The provinces pay their taxes, the legions patrol the borders, bread is distributed to the poor, life continues. And perhaps this is the strangest part of all. The empire, vast and ancient, adapts. It accommodates Nero's whims like a river winding around a rock, for now, at least. There are even moments, rare, confusing moments, where Sporus seems to embrace his role. At one banquet, he performs a poem said to be Poppaea's favourite. At another, he offers prayers at a public shrine while draped in Poppaea's ceremonial sash. Are these acts of agency, survival, or surrender? Historians still debate it. One fringe scholar argues that Sporus might have believed in a kind of reincarnation, that by taking on Poppaea's role, he was channeling her spirit, completing some cosmic loop. Others dismiss this as romanticised nonsense. More likely, Sporus was doing what any person in a gilded cage might do, survive the performance to see another day. There's another layer too, one that's less discussed. In a Rome ruled by appearances, Sporus's role complicates ideas of gender, power and identity. He's a boy performing womanhood not for his own sake, but for the emperor's. Yet in doing so, he holds a mirror to Roman masculinity, showing it as fragile, performative, and easily derailed by obsession. Some modern thinkers even see Sporus as an early, if unwilling, figure in the long history of gender nonconformity, though applying contemporary labels to ancient realities is always tricky. The court, for its part, seems to split into factions. Some embrace the fantasy, even call Sporus Augusta behind closed doors. Others see him as a ghost, a walking reminder of Nero's madness. A few pity him, a few plot his future, and then, inevitably, comes the backlash. In 68 AD, the cracks in Nero's rule become fissures. The army revolts in Gaul. The Senate, cowardly until now, finally turns against him. A new emperor is declared. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, switches sides with the speed of a well-oiled hinge. Rome no longer fears Nero. It pities him, or worse, laughs at him. In those final weeks, Nero clings to Sporus more tightly than ever. He flees the palace with a few loyal followers, Sporus among them, and hides in a suburban villa, barely recognisable in a simple tunic, his once glorious hair unwashed. There are no more actors, no audiences, no applause. The man who ruled the world now trembles at shadows and begs for mercy from gods he once mocked. Sporus stays by his side. When news comes that the Senate has condemned Nero to death, the Emperor panics. He can't do it. He can't take his own life. He begs his companions to help him. None do. Finally, his secretary Epaphroditus helps him stab himself in the throat. As Nero dies, he reportedly utters one final line, Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me, and then silence. The reign of Nero ends not with fire or glory, but with a whimper in a villa. The empire exhales, but Sporus' story is far from over. He steps from the shadows of Nero's madness into a new Rome, one scrambling to rebuild, to cleanse itself of scandal, to restore order. And now, Sporus becomes something else entirely. A symbol, a survivor, a walking enigma in a world desperate to forget. When the dust settles and the empire exhales, Rome finds itself in that familiar, uncomfortable place between tyrants. Nero is dead. The Senate breathes a little easier, the Praetorian Guard adjust their loyalties, and the people, those who once sang songs of Nero's generosity or trembled beneath his edicts, begin to rewrite his story in their minds. The graffiti on the city walls changes. His statues are quietly pulled down or defaced. Historians sharpen their pens, some to condemn, others to mythologize. And through all this, one question remains unspoken but persistent. What becomes of Sporus? The answer, like much of his life, is stranger than fiction. He is not imprisoned, not executed, not even cast out. Instead, he is absorbed back into the elite swirl of Roman political life, this time not as a bride, but as a curiosity, an oddity from a fallen court. He becomes, in effect, a prize, a living relic from the reign of the unhinged artist-emperor, passed like fine silverware from one political player to another. At first, he is taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect who helped orchestrate Nero's fall. Sabinus, like many in power, sees Sporus not as a person but as a symbol, a trophy from the most bizarre chapter in Rome's recent history. Having Sporus at his side is like carrying Nero's ghost on a leash. It confers a kind of twisted prestige. Sabinus doesn't marry Sporus, at least not in any formal sense, but he treats him publicly as a consort. The same Sporus who once wore Poppeia's jewels now appears in Sabinus's entourage, clad in Roman purple, silent and exquisite. The crowds no longer kneel, they stare, some with pity, others with scorn. A few with a flicker of recognition. The same face, the same manner, the same eerie echo of an empress who never was. Rome reacts, but quietly. The Senate doesn't address Sporus' presence. The public avoids talking about him too loudly. He's like a bad dream no one wants to analyse. The rituals of state continue, the legions march, and Sporus remains, an unspoken reminder of how far the empire allowed itself to fall under Nero's spell. But then Sabinus overreaches. He tries to claim the throne for himself, a bold move for a man who was never part of the imperial family. He argues that Nero named him successor. Few believe him. The troops, tired of switching loyalties like togas, finally snap. Sabinus is murdered by his own men before he even sees the inside of a palace, and Sporus, once again, he survives. Now effectively a political orphan, Sporus is taken in by yet another man of power, Otho. Yes, that Otho. The very same man who was once Poppeia's husband, long before Nero stole her away and sent him off to govern distant Lusitania. Otho, in a twist worthy of a soap opera, becomes emperor for an entire 3 months during the Year of the Four Emperors, one of the most chaotic stretches in Roman history. Otho's motivations for bringing Sporus into his circle are murky. Is it nostalgia, irony, revenge? Did he see in Sporus a warped connection to Poppaea, the woman he lost twice, once to Nero, once to death? Or did he simply recognise Sporus's political utility, knowing full well the boy man's presence could destabilise his enemies, unsettle the Senate, and stir memories best left dormant? Whatever the reason, Sporus once again finds himself draped in imperial fabrics, walking the halls of power, an ornament to a man who sees him as something more than human and less than free. He's not empress this time. He is something else, something undefined, always on the edge of satire or tragedy. But Otho's reign is brief. He loses a civil war to Vitellius, another pretender with more legions and less patience. Facing defeat, Otho commits suicide in a final dramatic gesture meant to preserve Roman dignity. And Sporus? still not dead, still not free, still navigating the ruins of men who keep collapsing around him. The new emperor Vitellius is not subtle. He is brutal, gluttonous, and entirely uninterested in Nero's old court. And yet, he too cannot resist the temptation of Sporus. Maybe he sees him as a mockery worth exploiting. Maybe he wants to erase Nero's legacy by turning it into a joke, or maybe he's just bored. Whatever his reasons, Vitellius hatches a plan. He will have Sporus publicly humiliated during a festival. Not just embarrassed, violated. Ancient sources suggest Vitellius intended to dress Sporus as a bride, again, and stage a reenactment of the rape of Proserpina, a gruesome myth about a goddess kidnapped by the underworld. In this twisted tableau, Sporus would once again become a stand-in for something divine, only to be torn down for entertainment. It is, in essence, the final act of a nightmare play that began years earlier in Nero's bedroom. Sporus hears of the plan. He knows what it means. He's lived enough versions of this role to know the ending. This time he refuses to perform. This time he chooses his exit. Before the entertainment can begin, Sporus takes his own life. The details are sparse. Was it poison? A blade? We don't know. All we know is that he dies alone, in some corner of Rome, not as an empress, not as a bride, not even as a consort, but as a boy who was never allowed to be himself. A footnote in history, a mirror held up to Rome's worst instincts. His death is noted by chroniclers with barely a sentence. No one marks his grave. No statue is raised in his honour. He vanishes into the margins of history like a sigh in a colonnaded corridor. And yet his story lingers, not because he wielded power, or led armies, or built monuments, but because he was dragged through the machinery of empire and reshaped into something unreal. Because in Sporus, we glimpse the dark heart of Roman spectacle, the grotesque edge of grief, obsession, and absolute control. Sporus was never meant to survive as long as he did, and when he finally refused the role written for him, he wrote the ending himself. Rome for once falls silent. The golden facade of Nero's Rome may glitter under torchlight, but behind it lurks something far less elegant, a court life of indulgence, spectacle, and quiet horror. With Sporus installed as his surrogate bride, Nero's personal palace becomes a theatre in constant rehearsal, where roles are assigned, scripts are rewritten nightly, and reality is suspended in favour of performance. At first glance, life inside the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, is everything a decadent emperor could desire. Walls glimmer with gold leaf, ceilings are encrusted with precious stones, hidden doors lead to banquet rooms that rotate to simulate the movement of the stars. Scented petals drift down from the ceilings, falling on the heads of guests who pretend not to notice the subtle choke of artificial sweetness clinging to their wine. But the deeper one walks into Nero's inner sanctum, the stranger things become. There are halls that echo with rehearsals, Nero's voice rising and falling in tragic verse. There are musicians who play for hours while the emperor practices dying on stage. Actors and dancers live in residence not as guests but as accessories, and at the centre of it all, Sporus, veiled and silent, sits on a throne just slightly lower than Nero's. His presence is a reminder that this entire court is a play with no final act. Lavish feasts are held almost nightly. These aren't just dinners, they are performances, psychological tests, social trials. Nero has a talent for hosting evenings that begin in splendour and end in disaster. Guests are assigned roles: the tragic widow, the drunken god, the vengeful hero. Wine flows freely, but so do suspicions. Laughter is loud, but too practised. The real rule of Nero's court is this: always applaud. Sporus sits quietly during these affairs, dressed in silk, his features powdered, his expression unreadable. He does not speak unless prompted. When he does, it's with rehearsed elegance, a tone that mirrors Poppeia's remembered cadence. He lifts his cup only when Nero lifts his. He smiles when Nero smiles. He cries when Nero recites tragic poetry. And when the feast turns ugly, as it often does, he retreats behind his veil, untouchable, unreal. Guests whisper that Sporus has become a ghost, not just of Poppaea, but of himself. The transformation isn't just physical, it's psychological. Day by day, his identity is peeled away and replaced with performance. There are reports of him being coached in private, taught to speak like Poppaea, to walk like her, to replicate gestures from old portraits. Nero doesn't want a companion, he wants a resurrection. Behind closed doors, things are even more unsettling. Nero is known to switch roles in his fantasies. One night he plays the tragic husband, weeping over his lost bride. The next, he demands Sporus enact scenes of betrayal and reunion. There are whispered accounts of Nero forcing Sporus to perform dramatic soliloquies, to faint on cue, to scream in grief and whisper in ecstasy, all for the Emperor's pleasure. These aren't games, they're rituals. It's during these private plays that Nero's cruelty often spikes. One servant recalls being ordered to whip Sporus, not in anger, but as part of a performance. "She betrayed me," Nero reportedly snarled. "She must suffer, but beautifully." The servant obeys. Sporus does not flinch. This too is theatre. The emotional toll must have been staggering, yet no record survives of Sporus's thoughts. No letters, no poems, no testimonies. His inner world is a locked chamber. We're left only with the reflections of others, historians, courtiers, scandal-hungry chroniclers, all watching from the outside as the boy inside the veil disappears. And yet, even in this twisted arrangement, Sporus holds power. Not political, not official, but symbolic. He is Nero's obsession, and thus untouchable. While senators are exiled or executed on a whim, while generals are sent to die in pointless campaigns, Sporus remains. His survival is perhaps the only constant in a court that shifts like sand. Rome outside the palace is changing. Whispers of famine and rebellion drift in through the palace gates. But inside, the emperor remains preoccupied. He plans a grand performance in Greece, a tour where he'll sing and act before the gods themselves, or at least their priests. Sporus is expected to attend, dressed in ceremonial white, seated beside the emperor's muse and consort. In one infamous moment, Nero stages a mock marriage in a Greek temple. Sporus, in full bridal regalia, is walked down an aisle again, this time with priests offering blessings to the union. The ceremony is seen by hundreds, maybe thousands. Some believe it to be a religious rite, others see it as blasphemy. But no one dares object. The emperor demands applause. The emperor always demands applause. One curious fact: some Greek cities awarded Nero victory prizes for performances he hadn't yet given. That's the kind of reality Nero lives in now, one where the outcome of everything is predetermined, and the narrative always bends to his will. Sporus, as his living prop, plays his part without fail. But beneath the surface, something stirs. Sporus is seen less frequently at court. Rumours begin that he's ill. Others whisper he has started speaking in his own voice again, forgetting lines, hesitating before answering to Poppaea. A few courtiers claim Nero grows irritated, less enamoured, more controlling. He begins to look for new muses, young faces to cast in fresh roles. Sporus's status, once so secure, begins to wobble, yet he remains. Historians still argue whether Sporus stayed out of fear, strategy, or some warped sense of duty. Some say he began to believe in the performance. Others claim he was planning escape, but there's no escape from the emperor's stage, not until the curtain finally falls. As Nero grows more paranoid, his court thins out, executions rise, feasts become smaller, applause comes more slowly. Sporus continues to appear, but more as a ghost than a guest. One servant notes that his eyes seem hollow now, his steps mechanical. "Like a doll," she writes, "whose strings are slowly breaking." There's a final detail worth noting. In one of Nero's last public appearances, he stages a private tragedy for a select audience. He plays a dying husband. Sporus plays the ghost of his wife visiting from the underworld. The performance ends with the emperor cradling Sporus in his arms, weeping, calling him by Poppaea's name. The audience applauds dutifully, but one senator writes in his diary, "Never have I seen a spectacle so pitiful and so profoundly wrong." Soon after, Nero's downfall begins, but within the palace the golden walls still shimmer, the fountains still murmur, the corridors still echo with distant music and forgotten lines, and Sporus still sits beneath the flickering lamplight, wearing someone else's memory like a second skin. He has survived the feasts, he has survived the roles. But how much of him remains? Sporus is often remembered in the margins, footnoted under Nero's eccentricities, described as a favourite, a companion, or a bizarre footnote to imperial madness. But what that framing fails to capture is the quiet, persistent tragedy of his life. A boy stripped of autonomy, sculpted into someone else's fantasy, and paraded through the most treacherous corridors of power in Roman history. The tragedy begins not with Nero's obsession, but with Rome itself, the way it consumes beauty, youth, and vulnerability, especially in its imperial centre. From the moment Sporus is chosen, he is no longer a person. He is a project, a tribute, a resurrection on 2 feet. By the time Nero names him Poppaea, Sporus's original name, identity and past dissolve into myth. No one asks where he came from. No one records his lineage, his voice, his preferences. His body is altered, his wardrobe reassigned, and his purpose rewritten. He is groomed, dressed, instructed, and unleashed not as himself, but as a revenant, a ghost wrapped in silk. His every gesture becomes loaded with meaning. A nod of the head is interpreted as affection. A quiet dinner attendance is broadcast as love. But what did Sporus actually feel? We will never know, because his silence was the key to his survival. In a palace where speaking out of turn could result in exile or worse, where the emperor's grief wore the mask of affection and obsession dressed as devotion, silence was armour, and yet silence is not the same as peace. Imagine, if you will, a day in Sporus's life. He wakes in silk sheets, the morning light catching on gilded furniture. Attendants enter quietly, as they would for an empress. He is bathed, perfumed, dressed. His robes match the latest Greek fashions, selected to accentuate his resemblance to Poppaea. A touch of rouge is added to his cheeks. His hair is curled, a crown set upon it. He eats only when summoned. He speaks only when spoken to. His schedule includes temple visits, ceremonial appearances, staged outings through the forum, where people stare but do not speak. To outsiders, he is blessed. He lives in a palace, wears priceless jewels, and dines on delicacies. But there's no privacy, no identity, and certainly no choice. Each movement is a dance choreographed by grief, obsession, and control. He is both idol and prisoner, the embodiment of a love that has curdled into something unrecognisable. There are moments, fleeting and chilling, when Sporus is reportedly caught rehearsing alone, practising Poppaea's walk, her voice, even her gestures. These glimpses raise uncomfortable questions. Is he trying to please Nero, perfect his role, or has he begun to believe he really is her, at least in part? Historians still debate the psychological toll. Some argue that Sporus dissociated, a coping mechanism that allowed him to endure. Others suggest he was strategic, maintaining his performance to stay alive. Still others suspect that in a court governed by delusion, internalizing the role may have been the only way to remain sane. What's clear is that Sporus becomes a figure of contradiction. To the court he is both honoured and mocked. Nobles toast him at banquets, but whisper behind fans about the boy bride. Poets include him in verses, some romantic, some cruel. One satirical playwright pens a thinly veiled farce featuring a ghost bride who refuses to die. Nero laughs until he doesn't. The playwright disappears. The Roman people, ever observant, offer their own commentary. Murals and graffiti begin to appear, some sympathetic, depicting Sporus as a captured nymph or a weeping goddess. Others are less kind, crude caricatures mocking Nero's marriage, suggesting divine punishment is on its way. And indeed, punishment does come, though slowly. As Nero's reign slips from decadence into collapse, the city's patience wears thin. Food shortages, military revolts, and political unrest gather like a storm cloud over the Palatine Hill. Through it all, Sporus remains at Nero's side, seated at the theatre, attending state functions draped in silk, while senators fume and the poor riot. Then comes a shift. Sporus begins to appear less frequently. He no longer accompanies Nero to every feast. There are whispers that he is unwell. Some say he tried to flee. Others claim he began resisting the role, refusing the bridal robes, correcting those who called him Poppaea. Nero, once infatuated, grows distant. This pattern is familiar. Nero elevates, then discards. He does it to friends, wives, and mentors, to mothers and lovers. Once Sporus stops serving the fantasy, he becomes expendable. But unlike others, Sporus is not cast aside with violence. Instead, he is sidelined with silence. The boy who once sat at the Emperor's right hand is now kept behind closed doors. His attendants are reduced, his schedule cleared. One rumour claims he is locked in a private suite, allowed out only when Nero requests a visitation. It's here, in the quiet, that the tragedy deepens. Stripped of performance, what remains? Does Sporus begin to reclaim himself? Does he lie in bed at night, remembering a time before the palace, before the silk, before the surgeries and rehearsals? Or has the role so consumed him that there's nothing left to recover? We'll never know. What we do know is that he survives. When Nero flees Rome, Sporus flees with him. In a final, frantic spiral of paranoia and desperation, Nero gathers a few loyalists and hides in a villa outside the city. Sporus is there, the last witness to an emperor's unravelling. He watches Nero tremble, beg for help, fail to die with dignity. When the blade finally falls, Sporus remains standing, and then, in the strange silence that follows an emperor's death, Sporus steps into yet another role, not as a consort, not as a symbol, but as a survivor. He walks through a Rome trying to forget what it allowed. He's taken in by new men, treated as a trophy, a ghost, a joke, and still he endures. One scholar notes that Sporus's life is a study in persistence without power. He controls nothing, commands no armies, leads no movements, and yet he lives through 4 emperors, 3 near deaths, and a cultural storm that would break most souls. And all of this before he's even 20. In a world that praises conquerors and condemns the conquered to silence, Sporus does something radical. He refuses to disappear. His story, warped and half-told, survives because he did. But survival, as we'll soon see, comes at a steep price. Nero's death is supposed to be an ending. For many it is, a closing act for a reign marked by fire, performance and paranoia. But for Sporus, it's just another scene change. The man who turned him into a living replica of a dead empress, who forced him into ceremonies, rituals and costumes, is gone. But the shadow he cast, that's still very much alive. The days following Nero's death are a chaotic blur. Rome, already teetering on the edge, stumbles headfirst into the year of the 4 emperors. 4 rulers in one year, Galba, Otho, Vitellius and Vespasian, each clawing for the purple like wolves at a carcass. The empire is now a stage with too many actors and no director. The Senate flips loyalties like coins, and the Praetorian Guard, supposed defenders of the emperor, sells its sword to the highest bidder. In the midst of this, Sporus is passed from man to man. First comes Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian prefect drunk on his own ambition. He positions himself as the heir to Nero's charisma, claiming, somewhat hilariously, that he, not Galba, should be emperor. It doesn't take long for people to notice that Sabinus has taken in Sporus, parading him around not unlike Nero once did. The same silk robes, the same eerie resemblance to Poppaea, now in service of a new aspirant's ego. Sporus once again is trapped in a performance that isn't his, but Sabinus overplays his hand. He declares himself princeps prematurely, before the Senate has even buried Nero's body. The Praetorian Guard, who once followed him, now turns. They murder him before he ever sets foot in the imperial palace. It's almost a relief. One less man trying to wear the mask of power. Sporus survives. Next, he's brought into the orbit of Otho, Nero's former friend and Poppaea's first husband. If history had a sense of irony, it would surely be smirking now. Otho, who lost Poppaea to Nero years ago, now takes in the boy who was remade in her image. What did he see when he looked at Sporus? A reminder of the woman he loved? A twisted echo of everything he'd lost? Or just another token from Nero's broken legacy? Under Otho, Sporus doesn't play the bride anymore. He becomes something different. An ornament, yes, but also a symbol. Otho knows the power of theatre, of optics. With Sporus at his side, he tells Rome, "I understand the court. I have inherited Nero's world. I am not afraid of its ghosts, but Otho's reign is brief. After losing the Battle of Bedriacum to Vitellius, he chooses to die with what's left of his dignity. He writes a letter to his people, has a final meal, and stabs himself in the heart. A clean exit in a messy year. And Sporus, still alive. Vitellius, the next emperor, is something altogether different. He's gluttonous, crude, and completely uninterested in subtlety. Where Nero bathed in metaphor and artifice, Vitellius is more interested in meat and mockery. And Sporus, once a veiled figure of delicate tragedy, is suddenly just another imperial plaything. Vitellius doesn't want a bride. He wants a spectacle. He plans a public humiliation, a performance that will parody Nero's marriage in the cruelest way possible. Sporus is to be dressed again as a bride, this time not for a solemn ceremony, but for a staged rape, reenacting the myth of Proserpina's abduction by Pluto. It's not art, it's not love, it's punishment, an attempt to erase Nero's legacy by dragging it through the mud. The plan is made public, the city prepares for the show, invitations are sent, costumes designed, but the curtain never rises. Sporus takes his own life before the performance can occur. The details are, as usual, lost to time. Some say he used poison, others a dagger. The location isn't even agreed upon. Perhaps a villa, perhaps a friend's house, maybe a quiet corner of the palace. But the gesture is clear. For the first and only time, Sporus chooses the end of his role. He refuses to be mocked, to be paraded, to be used one more time by another emperor with an appetite for domination. In a city that demanded obedience, where identity was a costume sewn by someone else's grief, Sporus's final act is resistance. Historians often overlook the weight of that gesture. Suicide in Roman culture can be an honourable exit, a reclaiming of control when all else is lost. For Sporus, it was likely the only way to assert any autonomy. After years of being reshaped, renamed, redressed, and repurposed, he writes his final line in his own hand, and then the stage falls silent. In the grand sweep of Roman history, his name appears briefly, then vanishes. No statue, no tomb, no memoirs, just fragments in the writings of others. Tacitus mentions him once, without much detail. Suetonius offers a few sentences, half mocking. Dio Cassius adds some colour, but not much clarity. They treat Sporus not as a person, but as a symptom of Nero's madness. But if we step back, if we look closely, we see more. We see a child torn from his world, refashioned into someone else's grief, held aloft as a symbol of devotion that was anything but. We see a boy who survived the fall of 3 emperors, who endured humiliation, manipulation, and loss, and who, in his final moment, said no. His life is a tragedy, but not because of who he was, because of what Rome made him be. Modern scholars continue to debate Sporus's role in history. Was he a victim, a puppet, a survivor? Did he ever wield influence, or was he merely carried by the current of imperial dysfunction? Some view him through the lens of gender, an early example of how society imposes identity. Others focus on the psychology of his endurance. How does a person maintain any sense of self when the world insists you are someone else? One thing is certain, Sporus endured, and in a city that destroyed so many, that alone is remarkable. The tragedy of Sporus is not just about Nero's madness, or Rome's appetite for spectacle. It's about the way power devours the vulnerable, about how memory can be rewritten, bodies reshaped, names reassigned, about how survival, in some eras, is the most radical thing a person can do. His story ends not with a sword or a triumph, but with silence, and sometimes silence says everything. The death of Nero marks not just the collapse of a dynasty, but the dramatic unravelling of a world crafted from illusion and indulgence. Rome doesn't weep for him, not publicly. The Senate erases his name from monuments. His likeness, once cast in gold and bronze, is melted down or smashed by citizens tired of watching their lives be used as the backdrop for one man's artistic meltdown. And yet, in the quiet corners of the city, people still speak his name, some in fear, others in fascination. Because emperors come and go, but legends, especially those dipped in scandal and sorrow, linger like the scent of incense on old stone. In the chaotic vacuum left behind, Rome scrambles to restore a sense of order. Galba takes power, then Otho, then Vitellius, all in less than a year. Civil war threatens to consume the empire. The economy staggers. The legions grow restless. Through it all, the name Nero becomes both a curse and a benchmark, a standard of excess, cruelty, and, strangely, style. Because for all his sins, Nero was unforgettable. And among the many strange remnants of his reign, burned villas, golden halls, broken statues, there's one that cannot be catalogued in marble or coin, Sporus. When Nero dies, Sporus doesn't vanish into history. He moves quietly, from palace to palace, man to man, each treating him not as a person, but as a kind of living curiosity. Some see him as a trophy, others a walking satire of Nero's love life. For a time, his mere presence is enough to draw attention at a feast or give political players an air of scandalous prestige. But then comes the end, his suicide staged in the shadows to avoid one final grotesque performance under Vitellius's rule. Nero's last words, allegedly whispered as he bled to death, were, "Qualis artifex pareo? What an artist dies in me." It's fitting in a way that Sporus was the last to hear them, because Sporus more than anyone bore the full weight of Nero's art. He was the canvas, the sculpture, the stage. He was the performance. And when Nero died, part of Sporus, perhaps the largest part, died with him. But what is left of the emperor in the years that follow? For a man who saw himself as immortal through art, Nero's posthumous career is complicated. He's not forgotten, not even close. In the East, particularly in parts of Greece and Asia Minor, he remains surprisingly popular. Some cities build shrines to him. Coins continue to be minted with his face, sometimes decades after his fall. A strange myth even emerges, that Nero is not truly dead, but in hiding, preparing to return and reclaim his throne. This Nero Redivivus legend persists for years, even inspiring a few impostors. The Romans, ever practical, begin to compartmentalize him. They condemn his actions, yes, but his style, his flair, his theatricality, that sticks. Future emperors learn from him, not necessarily his policies, but his stagecraft. Domitian, Commodus, and even Caligula, posthumously, are compared to him. And the comparison isn't always unflattering. For centuries, Nero becomes a symbol of imperial excess. His name appears in plays, poems, sermons. Medieval scribes paint him as the embodiment of sin. Christian writers claim he was the Antichrist, while Renaissance thinkers, oddly charmed by his artistic pretensions, view him as a tragic figure undone by passion. But what of Sporus? Here the trail fades. No one writes poems about him. No statues are carved in his honour. His life is too inconvenient, too ambiguous, too drenched in someone else's tragedy. Ancient writers mention him as a curiosity, a side character in Nero's twisted drama. Modern historians are only now beginning to ask deeper questions. Why was Sporus chosen? What did he feel? Could he have escaped? And, perhaps most hauntingly, was there ever a moment when he believed he was truly loved? The absence of answers only deepens the mystery. Unlike Nero, Sporus left behind no grand pronouncements, no monuments, no final words etched in history. But his silence speaks volumes. It echoes through the corridors of the Golden House, lingers in the margins of dusty scrolls, and hums like a half-remembered melody beneath the noise of history. There's a moment in Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, almost a throwaway line, where he refers to Sporus as that boy who most resembled Poppaea, as if his only significance was that resemblance, as if, without it, he would never have been seen. That line captures everything, because in Rome, being seen was both a blessing and a curse. It meant survival, status, danger. Sporus was seen over and over, but never for who he was, only for who he reminded someone else of, only for the shape he could take in another man's grief. Historians still argue whether Nero was truly in love with Poppaea. Some suggest it was all projection, that she was just another mirror for his ego. Others believe there was something genuine, if warped, in their connection. But almost all agree that what he felt for Sporus was not love. It was obsession, reanimation, theatre, a refusal to let go. And yet, there's a strange tenderness in how Nero clung to Sporus, in the songs he wrote, in the staged moments of mourning, in the way he recreated Poppaea's rituals and demanded they be reenacted with precision. It was control, yes, but it was also desperation. Nero could not accept death, so he dressed it in silk, gave it earrings, and married it. In that sense, Sporus was not just a symbol of lost love. He was a monument to Nero's refusal to face reality, a living protest against mortality, a testament to how power, when mixed with grief and unchecked imagination, can warp the human form into something utterly unrecognizable. And that is what Rome saw. A boy in bridal garments, a ghost dancing through golden halls, a reminder that even emperors with all their might cannot resurrect the dead. In time, the Domus Aurea is filled in with dirt, its opulence buried beneath new construction. The Flavian amphitheatre, what we now call the Colosseum, is built atop Nero's artificial lake. It's a symbolic erasure. The empire tries to forget, to cover the past in marble and distraction. But history is persistent. Nero's name reappears. His music, long lost, is referenced in later compositions. His myth, like his memory, proves hard to extinguish. And Sporus? He becomes the question mark in that myth, the footnote that refuses to fade, no matter how little is written. His life is one of forced performance, yes, but also one of endurance. And in the end, endurance may be the greatest act of rebellion. Because the empire could control his name, his body, even his role, but not his ending. When an emperor dies, Rome expects its politics to reset, like a board swept clean. But for the people who lived in the eye of Nero's storm, especially those like Sporus, there is no reset. There is only fallout. In the months following Nero's death, the empire convulses with instability. The year of the 4 emperors is a game of violent musical chairs, each new ruler seated atop the ruins of the last. Galba ascends first, a stoic relic of the old republic. He promises a return to virtue, but Rome has already forgotten what that looks like. Then comes Otho, with his tragic loyalty and flash of suicidal honour. Vitellius follows, greedy, impulsive, and vulgar. And finally, Vespasian, the general who learns quickly how to wield authority without quite suffocating under its weight. Each transition shakes the palace walls where Sporus once walked. Each new ruler inherits the same broken stage and tries to improvise their own ending. But for Sporus, there are no auditions anymore. He's cast as a symbol, a possession, a whisper of scandal from a regime everyone wants to forget. After Otho's death, Sporus is no longer cloaked in silks and precious stones. He is no longer walked in procession or seated beside the throne. He becomes, again, an object, passed to Vitellius, not by his own will, but as a spoil. There's no record of his resistance, no letters detailing his thoughts, just a trail of imperial footsteps moving over his life like sand erasing a name on stone. Vitellius is the last man Sporus serves, and he is also the most grotesque. Where Nero demanded elegance and illusion, Vitellius demands amusement. His Rome is not a dream world of art. It is a carnival of appetites. Under Vitellius, Sporus is no longer called Poppaea. There are no veils or ceremonies. Instead, there's a new plan. A public performance mocking the marriage that once captivated and horrified Rome. Sporus is to be dressed as a bride once again, not in honour but in parody. The scene is lifted from myth. Proserpina, dragged into the underworld, raped by Pluto, lost to the living. Vitellius intends to stage this as entertainment. Sporus will play the goddess. Vitellius himself, some sources claim, might play the violator, or perhaps he would assign that role to a favoured gladiator. It is unclear. What is clear is this. It would not be a play in the traditional sense. It would be public degradation, a performance of pain for the pleasure of others, the emperor's private revenge against a memory he did not make but wanted to mock. It's easy to imagine the preparations. Costumers selecting fabrics that parody bridal wear. Stagehands building sets that resemble temples and underworld caves. Musicians rehearsing eerie hymns. All of Rome buzzing, half in anticipation, half in dread. They've seen Nero act. They've seen blood in the amphitheatre, but never this. And at the centre of it, Sporus. He would have been told what to wear, what lines to speak, what screams to rehearse. But this time he says no. Whether quietly or with fury, whether planned in solitude or decided in a flash of resolve, Sporus escapes the script. He takes his life, his one possession that Rome has not yet stolen. No guards stop him, no attendants interfere. He dies before the curtain can rise. His death, like his life, is barely recorded. A few lines in ancient histories, a name among many. But what he does in that final act changes everything. He denies the empire its entertainment. He refuses to complete the play. Historians still debate the logistics. Was he alone? Did anyone mourn him? Did Vitellius rage when the performance collapsed? Did the people who prepared the spectacle feel relief or disappointment? We don't know. His death left no speeches, no monument, no spectacle, only silence. And in that silence, Sporus finally becomes his own. His story, however, continues because others keep telling it. and in telling it, they reshape it. He becomes a metaphor for Nero's depravity, a symbol of Rome's excess, a cautionary tale, a curiosity, but never a person. Until modern scholars begin to ask different questions. Today, Sporus is examined not as a footnote, but as a lens. His life invites a reckoning with gender, power, trauma, and performance. What does it mean to be forced into another's identity? To have your body altered, your name changed, your past erased? What does it mean to survive that, and then choose your exit? In gender studies, Sporus has become a subject of complex discussion. Was he trans? Was he a castrated boy performing femininity under duress? Can modern identities be retroactively applied to someone who never left us their own account? The debates are impassioned, unresolved, and necessary. Because at the centre of them is a truth historians long ignored. Sporus mattered. He wasn't just a symbol of Nero's madness. He was a human being crushed under the machinery of the empire. He had a voice we never heard, thoughts we never recorded, choices we rarely considered his to make. In literature and art, Sporus appears in shadows, reimagined as tragic heroines, spectral brides, and lost spirits. Operas flirt with his story, often blending fact with fiction. Modern writers use his name to explore themes of bodily autonomy and the weaponization of grief. He becomes a symbol, yes, but now one with depth. Even in medical history, Sporus emerges as a case study in ancient castration practices. His body becomes a battleground for discussion on how Rome treated gender, sexuality, and control. But perhaps most importantly, his story is now told not just as Nero's ornament, but as Sporus's survival. And yet, there are still gaps. No one knows where he was born. No one knows how he was chosen. No one knows if he had family. These absences haunt his story, making every word about him a reconstruction, a shadow play. But maybe that's fitting, for someone who spent his life in someone else's costume. What we do know is this. Sporus lived in one of the most volatile, theatrical, and dangerous courts in Roman history. He survived multiple emperors, escaped at least one public humiliation, and died on his own terms. And for all the silence that surrounded his life, that single act of refusal echoes louder than any imperial proclamation. Rome didn't know what to do with Sporus, and in the end, neither do we. Sporus's final act, his suicide to avoid Vitellius's grotesque parody of marriage, should have closed the curtain on his tragic story. And yet, like all figures who are used as symbols, his afterlife in memory continues long after his body vanishes from the historical stage. His death may have denied Rome its cruel spectacle, but it could not stop the retelling, reinterpreting and reshaping of his life into cautionary tales, whispered gossip, and uncomfortable metaphors. The question that lingers, what was it all for? Sporus never held power. He never wrote poetry, passed laws, or led armies. He didn't leave behind a doctrine or a political legacy. And yet, somehow, he stands at the epicenter of one of the most infamous reigns in Roman history, a mute, veiled witness to imperial delusion. His significance does not come from what he said or did, but from what was done to him, and how his identity was contorted to suit the needs of others. And therein lies the tragedy. After his death, there is no public mourning, no funeral recorded, no epitaph. Rome moves on, as empires do, hungry for the next chapter, the next performance. But the silence that follows isn't merely forgetfulness, it is intentional. Sporus becomes the story Rome doesn't know how to tell. Even the historians of the time seem uneasy about him. Tacitus, usually so eager to describe the depravity of the emperors, glosses over the details of Sporus's life. He mentions the name, recounts the infamous wedding, then returns to the politics, the wars, the betrayals. Suetonius is a bit more lurid, enjoying the scandalous implications, but even he seems uncertain whether to mock Sporus, pity him, or simply frame him as one more grotesque flourish in Nero's opera of excess. Dio Cassius gives us glimpses, brief but vivid. He references the marriage, the dressing in women's clothing, the theatrical elements of the relationship, but again, no deep dive, no reflection, no empathy. The sources treat Sporus not as a person, but as a prop. Historians still debate why. Perhaps it was discomfort. Even for ancient Rome, with its fluid views on sexuality and its taste for the sensational, Sporus's story was too strange, too close to something that unsettled the very foundations of identity. Rome could stomach cruelty. It could cheer at gladiator deaths, laugh at slaves torn apart by wild animals. But the idea of a living boy transformed into a dead woman, of grief manifesting as forced gender performance, was harder to categorise. It didn't fit into their moral binaries. Was Nero perverse, or just mad with grief? Was Sporus a willing participant or a helpless victim? Was the marriage a grotesque farce or a genuine attempt to rewrite reality? There were no easy answers, so instead, Rome tucked the story away, whispered it only when useful, and left Sporus behind. In the centuries that followed, Sporus became a kind of litmus test for historians, theologians, and artists. To early Christian writers, he was a symbol of Nero's degeneracy, a walking, breathing sin, a proof of the emperor's distance from divine order. Church fathers cited the marriage as evidence of Rome's moral decay, lumping Sporus in with the orgies, the cruelty, and the fiery end of Nero's reign. During the Middle Ages, Sporus's story largely disappears. Nero is remembered as a tyrant, yes, but the specifics of his court are blurred. The boy bride becomes a ghost, barely mentioned, hidden beneath layers of moral instruction and imperial critique. It isn't until the Renaissance, with its renewed interest in the strange and sublime, that Sporus resurfaces. Artists and playwrights become fascinated by Nero, not just the villain, but the tragic artist. His aesthetic sensibilities, his doomed performances, his poetic last words, all become fodder for plays and paintings. And in this reimagining, Sporus often reappears as the beautiful, tragic muse. Sometimes a shadowy figure in the background, sometimes a spectral bride, occasionally even a symbol of forbidden love. This romanticising continues into the 18th and 19th centuries, when Sporus becomes a subject for poets intrigued by gender ambiguity and the boundaries of love. The Victorians, ever conflicted about morality and desire, are both fascinated and horrified. Some writers cast Sporus as a warning of what happens when power is unmoored from virtue. Others see in him the outline of an unspoken truth, that identity, desire, and performance are more fluid than society admits. It's not until the 20th century, though, that Sporus begins to be studied seriously, not as Nero's puppet, but as a person caught in the machinery of empire, gender, and survival. Queer theorists examine his story through the lens of performance and trauma. Feminist scholars analyse the ways his body was used to reinforce Nero's control over memory and narrative. Historians of medicine study the implications of castration in Roman society, not as a punishment, but as a tool of transformation, a way to erase a body's resistance. The picture that emerges is deeply complex. Sporus was not just a symbol. He was a boy stripped of his autonomy, reshaped by the state's most powerful man, and pushed into a role that served neither the gods nor the people, but one man's grief and ego. He lived as someone else, survived by adapting, and died when the last performance threatened to consume what little was left of him. He is in many ways the ultimate expression of what Rome could do to a person. Rome, after all, was a city that turned people into monuments, both literally and figuratively. It sculpted its leaders, deified its dead, erased its disgraced, and in Sporus it found someone malleable, someone who could be moulded into memory's likeness. But unlike the marble busts and bronze statues, Sporus had a beating heart, and that heart, in the end, said no. There's an open scholarly debate about what kind of legal status Sporus held. Was he still a slave during the marriage? Did Nero ever grant him manumission? Could he own property, make decisions, control even a fragment of his life? Most evidence suggests he remained a dependent, never free in any meaningful way. His status, like his identity, was determined not by law, but by the whims of whoever held him. One day a bride, the next a consort, later a pawn, and finally a target of public mockery. No role was his to choose. This raises uncomfortable parallels with our own world, about who gets to define themselves and who is forced to perform a version of identity that suits someone else's narrative. Sporus's story, though ancient, resonates in the age of image and spectacle. He becomes a warning about the cost of erasure, not just physical, but personal. And yet, despite it all, Sporus endured. Longer than Nero, longer than Sabinus, longer than Otho. He survived 3 emperors and died not by execution, but by his own hand. That, in a way, is his legacy. Not the silk gowns or the ceremonies, not the whispered gossip or the uncomfortable laughter, but the refusal to continue the performance. He exited on his own cue, and that act, however tragic, was profoundly human. As the centuries stretch on and Roman marble gives way to the dust of empire, the tale of Sporus drifts into that curious space between legend and footnote. His name fades from common discourse. His likeness, never immortalised in paint or stone, becomes intangible. But in academic circles the story lingers, half-whispered, often misremembered, always strange. Even now, historians can't agree on what precisely happened. One school views Nero as a man who lost himself in mourning, consumed by guilt and longing after Poppeia's death. The marriage to Sporus, in this interpretation, is a perverse ritual of resurrection, a desperate refusal to let go. Sporus becomes the centre of a necromantic fantasy, a symbol of grief so potent that it supplants reality itself. Another theory frames Nero as less grieving lover, more calculating tyrant. The marriage, the spectacle, the transformation of Sporus into Poppaea all serve as the emperor's ultimate expression of control. Poppaea died, but only Nero could decide when her presence would truly leave. In that context, Sporus's forced metamorphosis was not just personal, but political. It sent a message. Nero could defy death, rewrite identities, and make the state applaud. Yet another perspective, more modern, more radical, asks whether we've misread the entire narrative by centering Nero's intentions instead of Sporus's experience. After all, what happens to someone when their very name is overwritten by another's? When every part of their self, voice, body, mannerisms, even memory, is shaped for someone else's mourning? This approach challenges the narrative inherited from Roman historians who, let's not forget, had their own biases. They were writing under new emperors, eager to discredit Nero, and what better way to delegitimize a fallen ruler than by pointing to a mockery of marriage and gender? It played to their audience's sense of moral order, reinforced the chaos of the previous regime, and conveniently erased the complexities of people like Sporus. In fact, one of the great scholarly debates today centres around whether the entire narrative of Sporus's bride is an exaggeration or even invention. Did the marriage ceremony actually happen, or was it imperial gossip bloated into legend? Was Sporus really made to wear Poppeia's clothes, or was that a poetic flourish by Tacitus, always eager to emphasise decadence? Historians still argue whether any legal document ever called Sporus Poppaea, or whether the boy himself ever responded to that name willingly. There are no surviving inscriptions, no letters, no testimony, just silence, into which everyone else projects their version of events. And then there's the fringe theory, that Sporus was not simply a stand-in, but someone Nero believed was truly possessed by Poppeia's spirit. This idea leans into ancient Roman beliefs about reincarnation, omens, and divine favour. It's admittedly speculative, but in a world where emperors consulted astrologers before issuing decrees, and where dreams could justify war, it's not beyond imagination. In this reading, the marriage was not just an indulgent parody, but a sacrament. Nero's private right to bind the soul of his lost empress to the body of the only person who resembled her. It casts Nero not as madman, but as a high priest of his own personal religion, with Sporus as both oracle and altar. Unsurprisingly, this theory is controversial. Most scholars dismiss it as fantastical, unsupported by evidence. But even so, it reflects something important. The way Sporus's story continues to disturb, to challenge, to resist clean interpretation, because he doesn't fit. Not into typical gender categories, not into Roman legal roles, not into the expected paths of slave or noble, lover or victim. His life was a disruption, and disruptions make history uncomfortable. That discomfort has only grown in recent decades, as conversations around gender identity, performance and power have entered mainstream discourse. Sporus has become a focal point for scholars trying to understand the ancient world's views on these subjects, not because he provides answers, but because he exposes the limits of modern labels. Was Sporus trans? It's a question that, by its very structure, imposes a modern lens on a world with different categories of thought. Rome had no concept of transgender in the contemporary sense, though it certainly recognised a spectrum of gender expressions. The Roman world acknowledged eunuchs, effeminate men, synedi, cross-dressers, priestesses of Cybele who lived as women after castration, and many more variations. But Sporus wasn't allowed to choose any of these roles. He was assigned one by the emperor. His body was altered not for religious reasons or out of personal desire, but because Nero needed a vessel. And in the absence of personal testimony, we can't say whether Sporus identified with the role, embraced it, resented it, or dissociated entirely. What we can say is that his life forces us to ask deeper questions about how identity is shaped and stolen. Even the word marriage, when applied to Nero and Sporus, is debated. Was it legal? Roman law allowed only the union of a citizen man and woman. So was the ceremony symbolic, satirical, sacred. Did it happen in Rome or abroad? Was it performed by priests, witnessed by officials? Or was it an elaborate act, more performance than partnership? There's also the issue of Sporus's castration. It wasn't unusual in certain Roman contexts, especially for palace eunuchs, servants in eastern provinces, or temple devotees. But Nero's use of castration wasn't religious. It wasn't even practical. It was aesthetic, symbolic. It ensured that Sporus's voice would remain high, his body delicate, that he would not masculinize into someone who could no longer pass for Poppaea. In that sense, Sporus's transformation wasn't about desire. It was about preservation, preserving the image of the dead, preserving the illusion of continuity, preserving Nero's sense of control, and so Sporus becomes, in historical memory, a vessel for other people's fears. To moralists, he represents corruption. To historians, decadence. To playwrights, tragedy. To modern readers, complexity. He is invoked in discussions of imperial abuse, of queerness in antiquity, of the violence of mourning. And each time he resists simple categorization. Some modern queer writers claim him as a lost ancestor, someone forced to perform gender in an extreme way, yet whose life highlights the very performativity of identity. Others hesitate, wary of turning a victim into a symbol. Feminist scholars see in Sporus the way patriarchal power reshapes bodies, assigning roles without consent. Trauma scholars view his life as an early case of prolonged identity erasure, under coercive control. And in classrooms the conversation continues. Was Sporus a puppet, a survivor, an unwilling empress, a silent witness, all of the above, none? The most honest answer may be the most painful. We do not know. We may never know. But that does not make his story any less urgent. In fact, it makes it more so. Because history, at its best, is not just about glorifying the conquerors or shaming the madmen. It's about listening for the voices buried in the margins, about piecing together the lives behind the legends, about seeing, even in silence, the outlines of a human being who refused, at the very end, to continue being anyone but himself. That is why Sporus' story endures, not because of Nero, but in spite of him. In trying to understand the story of Sporus, it becomes impossible not to confront the deeper architecture of Roman identity, particularly how gender, power, and public spectacle intertwined to form a society obsessed with appearances, roles, and dominance. Rome was not a place that simply accepted difference. It managed it, it codified it, and when needed, it exploited it. Sporus, unwillingly, sat at the very centre of that machinery. Rome's cultural and legal structures held rigid definitions for male and female. A man, vir in Latin, was expected to embody control of his household, his body, his emotions. He could dominate others, sexually and politically, but must never be dominated. Femininity, by contrast, was associated with submission, softness, interiority. A woman's power came through lineage, marriage, fertility. Public life, politics, and the law belonged to men. But of course, as with all societies, reality was more complicated. There were exceptions, workarounds, and quiet resistances, and there were also calculated transgressions, especially by emperors. Nero's marriage to Sporus wasn't simply an eccentric act of personal grief. It challenged, some would say exploded, Rome's conventional categories. A man marrying another man, or at least someone assigned male at birth, in public, with full imperial honours, it violated every social expectation. Yet it happened, or at least was witnessed by enough people to be recorded in multiple historical accounts. So how did Rome make sense of it? With sarcasm, mostly. Writers like Suetonius and Dio Cassius frame the relationship in terms of Nero's madness. The marriage becomes a punchline, another indicator of his descent into tyranny. But even their scorn reveals unease, because the marriage wasn't a private affair. It was performed, on stage, before gods, senators, soldiers, citizens. It was Rome witnessing itself inverted and unable to look away. Some modern scholars have suggested the marriage was Nero's ultimate provocation, a way to assert absolute authority by violating social norms with impunity. Others believe it was a psychological breakdown, a visible symptom of unresolved grief, and still others read it as a moment of unexpected vulnerability, a confession through spectacle, a way for Nero to process trauma in the only language he understood: performance. But this interpretation too often forgets Sporus. What did it mean to be made into an empress in a society that had no space for such a person? Sporus's forced transformation brought Rome's gender expectations into sharp relief. He was not allowed to be male, nor truly female, nor outside either category. He was not a priest of Cybele, whose gender-altered identity came with spiritual authority. He was not a prostitute, whose body was consumed but not respected. He was not even a court eunuch in the traditional Eastern sense. Instead, he was something new, a hybrid, an invention, and the reaction to him reveals just how deeply gender roles mattered in Rome. Nero's marriage to Sporus was scandalous, not simply because it was same-sex, but because it confused the visual grammar of Roman power. A woman on the imperial arm was expected, a boy in bridal garments. That was dangerous, not because of what it said about Nero's preferences, but because of what it implied about Roman order. Rome was built on a hierarchy of roles: master and slave, citizen and foreigner, man and woman, victor and vanquished. These binaries held the state together. To blur them, even symbolically, was to risk unravelling the social fabric. The elite could excuse orgies, violence, and even blasphemy. But gender ambiguity in the heart of state ceremony, that rattled the foundations, and yet it also fascinated. There's something undeniably compelling about the image of Sporus walking through the forum, veiled, jewelled, silent. It's unsettling, yes, but also theatrical, operatic. Rome loved a show, and Sporus was a show, a living performance of the empire's anxieties about change, identity, and loss. It's no accident that Nero's artistic aspirations and his gender-bending marriage occurred simultaneously. They were both expressions of a desire to reshape the world, not through law or conquest, but through narrative. Nero didn't just rule Rome, he narrated it. He composed its tragedies, assigned its roles, and demanded applause. Sporus was cast in the starring role, but not as a hero. He was the love object, the ghost, the bride, the body around which meaning gathered, but which was never permitted to speak for itself. This brings us to another tension in Roman society: the difference between public and private selves. Romans were obsessed with reputation, dignitas, gravitas, virtus. A man's name mattered more than his deeds. Appearances weren't just for vanity, they were politics. To control how one was seen was to control one's place in the world. But Sporus had no such control. From the moment he entered Nero's court, his self was overwritten. He was renamed, redressed, recast. He became a surface onto which others projected grief, desire, satire, and disgust. Even his body was altered to preserve the illusion, and yet, for all this manipulation, he endured. That endurance is more than survival. It is a form of quiet resistance. While Nero performed love, while the Senate performed loyalty, while Rome performed outrage, Sporus continued to live. He inhabited the role forced upon him, not because he accepted it, but because refusal wasn't yet an option. Until, of course, it was. His suicide, deliberate, final, unspectacular, is perhaps the clearest statement he ever made. By taking his own life, he refused the final performance that Vitellius had planned. He denied Rome the spectacle of his degradation. He chose not to play the goddess dragged into hell. In doing so, he reclaimed his agency. That act, simple, brutal, quiet, undermined everything Rome had built around him. It wasn't a rebellion of swords or speeches. It was the exit of a character who refused to say their lines, and that, more than anything, exposes the cracks in Rome's spectacle. Because empire depends on participation. on performance, on people playing their parts. When someone stops playing, when they step off stage, the illusion breaks. This, perhaps, is Sporus's final legacy. He reminds us that history is not only shaped by the powerful, the vocal, the victorious. Sometimes it is shaped by the silences, by the refusals, by the people who choose, however briefly, to be more than the roles they were given. In Sporus, we see the fragility of identity when controlled by others. We see the violence of love when mixed with power. We see the limits of spectacle and the cost of survival. And though his name may never be carved in marble, and his voice never recorded, his story endures, not because of what Rome made him become, but because he was more than even Rome could imagine. In the centuries since Sporus's life flickered briefly in and out of Rome's cruel spotlight, his story has continued to echo, not as a tale of triumph or conquest, but as something far more enduring, a whisper from the edges of power, an unsettling reminder of what empires are capable of when the human spirit becomes just another object of statecraft. Today, Sporus appears in the margins of history books, shaded by footnotes, often eclipsed by the gravity of the men who surrounded him: Nero, Otho, Vitellius. But through art, literature, and the critical gaze of modern scholarship, his shadow has lengthened. And as our understanding of identity, performance, and historical narrative evolves, so too does our willingness to look again and see differently. In modern culture, Sporus has been reimagined many times. In opera, he appears as a tragic figure, doomed by beauty and silence. In literature, he's a metaphor for the voiceless, a symbol of gender subversion, or a reluctant muse in someone else's psychodrama. Playwrights from the 19th century to the postmodern stage have recast Sporus as everything from a cross-dressing trickster to a divine androgyne, misunderstood and misgendered by a world not ready to hold his complexity. Even in digital culture, he resurfaces. On forums and blogs, his name appears in discussions about gender history, queer erasure, and the politics of public mourning. He's invoked in debates around the intersection of trauma and identity, and in explorations of how societies demand that certain bodies serve symbolic purposes. And among artists, particularly queer and trans creators, Sporus becomes a haunting ancestor, one who never had a choice, but who now, at least, can be remembered with intention. For all this, there's a tragic irony. Sporus likely never thought of himself as symbolic. He was just trying to stay alive. He didn't craft his narrative. He didn't publish his pain. He didn't write poetry about his experience, or leave behind reflections carved into walls. His legacy was forged entirely by others, by those who used him, and those who later tried to understand what that use meant. But even a life so thoroughly mediated can still reveal truth. Truth about how power distorts love. Truth about how grief seeks form, even if it must borrow someone else's body to do it. Truth about how history forgets the inconvenient until someone, somewhere, remembers. In Sporus, we see how Rome, supposedly the pinnacle of civilization, treated the human soul like a stage prop. And that should give us pause, because empires haven't changed as much as we like to think. They still consume bodies. They still demand performances. They still reward those who conform and punish those who don't. But there is also something more hopeful in Sporus's tale, if only in its final act. By choosing to end his story on his own terms, Sporus left the empire without its script. He refused the punchline. He denied the grotesque final performance Vitellius had planned. He became, at last, not an object of someone else's fantasy, but an agent of his own destiny. And that refusal resonates. It resonates because it forces us to ask who else has been recast, rewritten, or erased. It forces us to see the faces behind the masks, the humans behind the headlines. It reminds us that even in the darkest corners of history, there are moments, small, defiant, and pure, when someone says enough and steps out of the role imposed upon them. That's why Sporus still matters, not because he was an emperor or a general, not because he led armies or penned philosophies, but because he endured, and in the end chose to leave the stage rather than be rewritten once more. We live in a world still obsessed with spectacle, still eager to assign roles, and in that world Sporus is a mirror, not just of Rome, but of us. Let's not look away. Now, as we let this story dissolve into the quiet of the night, let's leave behind the marble columns and torchlit corridors of ancient Rome. Let the heavy velvet curtains of Nero's theatre fall, and with them the roles that Sporus was forced to play. Let his name linger, not as a symbol of excess or scandal, but as a reminder of resilience. Imagine him now, not in a costume or crown, but alone in a quiet room, light spilling through a shuttered window, his breath steady, his eyes finally free of performance. The noise of the city fades, the applause fades, the commands fade, only silence remains, and within that silence, perhaps, a moment of peace. Let your mind soften with that image. Cool marble beneath bare feet, silk no longer tight around the neck, the weight of expectation lifting like mist in morning sun. Let the shadows recede, let the stories quiet, let the stillness come. You've walked through an empire of masks tonight, through tragedy and theatre, power and protest. But now all that matters is rest. So breathe slowly. Let your body settle into the dark like a ship sinking gently into a harbour. The stage is empty, the lights are out, the story is over. The